Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the T.O.A podcast. I am your host, Onvermel, as usual, and here today with me is everyone's, well, I'm sure someone's favorite, Hau1. Greetings.
How?
How?
What?
The proper, pretty much always the greeting I think you're going to be giving now.
It is the, shall we say, most appropriate greeting I could be giving.
I mean, true. So, before we get into the topic, I'm just going to tell everyone if we can get to 100 subscribers, I will bury an Anua in the dirt. This is what my this is how we're gonna get subscribers. So yes, I'll bury an actual Anua in the actual dirt if I get to 100 subscribers. So make that happen. Now moving on. Besides getting that plug out of the way, moving on to the actual topic. For those who have been keeping up, which isn't that many, but we've been talking about our Lego webcomics that we have created online. And so last time, Hau1 and I talked about his larger of the webcomics, Android Files, and we might probably briefly mention Aquazone Breakfast News, which in some regards is the first true Lego webcomic.
Yeah, it's, at this point, well, actually, it's kind of ironic we're talking about it today, because today is a Saturday that I didn't update. Aquazone Breakfast News has had many hiatuses, and this is but the latest one.
It's like a bouncing ball, you know. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down, but it's always going to go back up probably eventually if you wait long enough.
Well, the big reason why Aquazone Breakfast News has so many hiatuses, especially in, say, the last 4 or 5 years or so, is that unlike Android Files and unlike Grandfather's Tales, and Grandfather's Tales was the very first comic I ever did and was kind of a prototype. We talked about Android Files last week, and it's sort of my grand epic one. Unlike both of them, Aquazone Breakfast News is not scripted, which means there's a lot more am I feeling it, seat of the pants. A lot of times the comics are only made
In response to something.
Maybe in response to something. I was going to say the night before, but actually the night before would be early by the standards of some of them. So over the last 2 years, 2 to 3 years, let's say during the COVID time frame, Aquazone Breakfast News has two kinds of comics. There's the Advent calendar ones, and we'll talk more about them separately.
A classic staple
which are
of webcomics.
Or they used to be once upon a time, and they are sort of their own category. But the other ones that I've done in the last couple of years, Aquazone Breakfast News has been pretty good for not too many hiatuses. But I have literally had the picture sitting on my computer, and maybe I've edited them.
Oh,
and I make the comic. I make the comic that goes up in the morning. So it usually updates at 7:30ish, somewhere between 7 and 8 usually, and I am making it at 6:30 to 8ish. Basically, as I'm drinking my morning coffee and as the kid or kids are playing on the floor and watching their shows, that's when I am editing.
That is a really strange morning routine. Not gonna lie, very strange morning routine.
It's my Saturday morning routine, and it's also because I don't script this comic, I don't know what they're going to say until then. So it's not like Android Files where I just had to finish editing it and slap the already written dialogue onto it. I may literally not know what the dialogue is until 15 minutes before I post it on Comic.
That's a blessing and a curse at the same time. Because on one hand, I mean, some of the funniest stuff ever, or just most entertaining stuff, is on the fly, and we know sometimes the picture will make dialogue appear from it, but other times, if you're not, let's say, the most caffeinated person in that morning, but you're still making a comic, you might have a pretty dull dialogue at times. I don't know if that's really been the case. I don't know, if I've ever seen. I mean, Episode Breakfast can be a little dry at times, but I wouldn't call it quite dull. I don't know the right word I'm looking for.
Yeah, I mean, it's the most important thing with Aquazone Breakfast is this is the reason that it exists. It exists to not be Android Files, or when it started, to not be Grandfather's Tale. It started in 2011 while I was in grad school. I'd moved to the United States. I'd been there for a few months, and because I was in a new country where I didn't know a ton of people, and my girlfriend, now my wife and the mother of the aforementioned children, she was in school and she was working, so I didn't see her all the time. And I didn't have a ton of friends of my own. So I spent a lot of time on the internet, which was perhaps more than I had before I'd moved up here for a few years. And I had time, I had my Lego collection with me in the same place for the first time in a few years. So I started a blog, and that blog
Yes.
needed content. So Grandfather's Tale would give it content every now and then, but because of the way Grandfather's Tale is created, it was a whole chapter at a time, which meant multiple pictures, and it was serious. So I wanted it to look fairly good, and I wanted it to
Drops,
be
different
good.
locations, many characters.
All of those things, and because it was serious, I wanted to do it right, and there was a story to it. The whole point of Aquazone Breakfast News was sort of to not be that, but to be something that I could put up on a regular basis. Um, and it was perhaps a little bit more ambitious at its very, very beginning with different backdrops and stuff, but I settled pretty quickly on
You had more than one
okay, the
backdrop at
reason.
the beginning. I thought you literally just had the one backdrop for like forever.
Well, that Lucian and Alex appear in, but there were like because in the very first run, they Lucian and Alex, who are our co-hosts, they talk about aquanauts and aquasharks and aquaraiders and hydronauts and stingrays. They sort of go through Aquazone and why Aquazone is awesome, and they talk about all the different sub themes. And so it would be a picture of them talking, maybe another picture of them talking, and the punchline picture, which would be a picture of the theme that they were talking about.
Right. The whole argument is Pirates Aquazone theme. Okay, okay, I'm kind of getting the
Yeah, it's been a long time. So it's been the comic's been around for about 11 years now, and it's evolved over the years to be less Aquazone centric. At this point, we have not seen the Aquazone Breakfast News studio set, which I still have built. We
naturally.
haven't seen that in probably about a year and a half to 2 years, and they've been bumming around as the guests of Dr. Cyber. Because Dr. Cyber's
Look, Dr.
Mystic Method
Cyber's just
time
been
lag,
slowly taking over all the comics ever so slightly.
it is his
Okay, at the
destiny, I
moment,
suppose.
you have Dr. Cyber with Axon Breakfast News. Zacta had Dr. Cyber running last year's tournament, and which only just ended pretty recently. In A Pirate's Life, they're looking for Dr. Cyber, I believe. So, like, he's kind of makes those way into like half the comics right now.
And that's sort of his shtick in our games is that he
He's
is
pretty
the
much like the
great
Doctor.
connecting figure.
Well, I would say he's kind of like the Doctor, where you have all these different like time eras, but there's one character who instead of time eras, it's universe, and there's kind of just one character who keeps popping in and out of all of them.
Yeah. So originally, once upon a time, the idea was that this is going to be a light-hearted comic, and it was sort of going to be grounded in Aquazone. And part of the reason for going for Aquazone is that it is the anti-Castle. Castle is my well, one of my favorite types of Lego. It bounces around, but Castle's always held a top three spot, even in its off days. And Aquazone Breakfast News is the complete opposite of that.
I mean,
So,
I would say even in the title of that, it's self-explanatory. Because if I'm going to interject here for just a quick second, because I was actually going to ask this was looking at like our favorite themes of castle, space, pirates, and to a lesser extent or a more extent for us younger ones, Bionicle, like all these grand themes with like grand stories and epic battles, and those that also Grandfather's Tale reflected that kind of desire, and instead you have probably one of the smallest themes, the most I would say historically underutilized theme, um, used as a breakfast news, like a breakfast morning talk show, which is like how much more um, boring, for the lack of a better term, but like boring as an intentional, I would say boring. Could you get?
yeah, it's supposed to be non-epic. So,
You
yeah, like Castle was an epic. I was trying to write an epic, and in a lot of ways, Grandfather's Tale, although I still like what I did, and I still think it was pretty good for what it was trying to be.
yeah,
It was hard in a lot of ways because I hadn't learned how to efficiently make comics. And where I'm at now with Android Files is the result of struggling with Grandfather's Tale and cutting as many corners as possible in Aquazone Breakfast News and sort of developing the muscles in both of them so that in Android Files I can write as fancy as I want, but in terms of actually taking the pictures and putting text on them, I'm a lot faster and better at it now because I've done so much of it.
I can agree with that because even with just me making the comics for Crossword Championship for March, I was able to do all mine that I needed in within one day, and it was like really quick and easy. In fairness, though, I did cheat a little bit. You'll see when I get to that point, but no, it is definitely a noticeable. I would say that you've, let's be honest, that, I would say got the template format for a lot of our comics that we have pretty much all copycatted after. At least me specifically, I would say I've very much taken that because you look at Rock Miners, mine, and it's pretty much the exact same sort of formatting as Hackers on Breakfast News.
Yeah, originally when I started, it was a pretty rigid 4-panel comic, two across the top, two across the bottom. But I realized pretty early on that the size that I'd made it meant that the pictures were going to be quite small doing that. And originally it was a 650 pixel width. And the reason for that is because this was content for Blogger, for my blog. And that was how wide it displayed on my more or less standard computer screen.
So you opted
I
for a more vertical look.
So I opted for a more vertical look, generally sort of the panels sort of zigzag back and forth a bit.
Almost comic
And that
book-esque.
almost comic book-esque, and that was kind of helpful too, because the blank space of the background on the sides of the panels gave me extra spots for putting some of the dialogue. And spoiler alert, I tend to write long dialogue.
A lot. I'll be honest, definitely out of all the comics, yours are the wordiest comics. And I would say Aquazone Breakfast News can get the wordiest at times. I mean, it's a new
It,
show,
it
so being wordy is not really a flaw in it.
Well, and unlike Android files, there's no editing. Android files, I script it far enough in advance that I sometimes will cut back on stuff. And also, especially since I've started typing up the scripts on the computer, I can see visually when I'm like, oh, this is going to be a really long hunk of dialogue.
Make some room for it.
So make some room, or I need to break it up, or I need to do something. But Aquazone Breakfast News, it's just like, nope, it's as it comes out of my head, more or less. Um, and so the format is the whole comic's on one page, and it's usually 3 or 4 panels. Some go longer, especially some of the Christmas ones during Advent calendar season. But as a general rule, that's sort of the standard format: 3 or 4 panels. Lucian and Alex, and possibly other characters, depending on what's going on, talking about something, end with a stupid punchline. Wash, rinse,
I
repeat.
do admit, I do miss those earlier days of them just discussing Lego themes, but I would say that your writing for it had came to the same problem that actual news sources come through. It's actually something interesting to talk about.
Yeah, and it's sort of the when I started, I did a pretty good run in my first couple of years while I was still in grad school, and then when I was unemployed. My biggest problems were for keeping a consistent schedule had more to do with my computer dying or not having internet than it had to do with making the comics. Once I got a full-time job with 40 plus hours a week, and usually the plus, it was a lot harder to maintain that consistent schedule, and we started falling into the many hiatuses.
Let's be honest, hiatuses are a staple of Houston webcomics, unless you are Zach Taz with Randomly Assembled. Actually, Zach Taz in general. I don't think he's ever had a hiatus of anything.
And anything he's had has been
Yeah,
planned,
he's had schedule
which,
breaks for like I know Bionicle Tales and Amongst the Stars have had schedule breaks, but he's never had a hiatus. Like you got to give the man props and credit there because Eck knows hiatuses. You and Eck both know hiatuses so well. Me, I've had 2 hiatuses with my one comic, and I'm still in my second hiatus, which has been about 2 years in making almost. following a
Yeah, it
2-year hiatus.
yeah, it and part and this was like we said last time, part of my goal with Android files was I wanted to do something serious and I wanted to do something where I, sort of could upload a whole bunch at once and have consistent content for a while, but I wouldn't have to be there every week. And the reason that that was important to me is because, well, I tried being there every week with
Didn't work
Aquazone
so well.
Breakfast News and never had very good success with that.
I do.
Not once I had a full-time job anyway.
What I do find a little ironic about Axon Breakfast News meant to be a less not an epic and just uh, a simple light comic. When you tried turning into an epic, which there was about, I think currently right now it would be known as the second phase of Aquazone Breakfast News. You started turning into an epic, and then you went on a really long hiatus and kind of just like skipped over everything, pretending you never like saying like, yeah, never mind. It's funny how like you once you started turning into more of an epic story or something that like taxed you more, or was it the timing? And it's like, nope, this isn't working out.
Yeah, the timing was really bad for that.
It was a sign that
And
you should
and
not make it an epic.
well, the reason I think that the epic idea sort of came around is because of the advent calendars.
Yeah, Santa Mola did a
So
lot.
in 2011, Christmas season, I posted a daily comic from December 1st to December 24th, which are days that knowing people will realize can perfectly match the days that you open your Lego Advent calendars. And the idea of making a Advent calendar comic following the whatever one of Lego's actual advent calendars that year is not something I came up with. That is by no means an original idea. I want to be very clear here.
Yeah, where
I stole this idea.
from? I want to know who started that. Was that like reasonably clever? Was it irregular webcomic? Like, where did that start from?
If I am right, I think it was reasonably clever, or at the very least, he's sort of the one that popularized it. A bunch of the uh, what was the name of it? The Brick Comic Forum comics did it.
That's a
Um,
mouthful.
but reasonably clever is certainly the one that I first encountered it with.
Same.
And I read a few of the other comics that had it, and it was like, this is fun, this is interesting, and you know what? This is the perfect nonsense comic for my comic.
Also, who doesn't like opening a new little Lego bag every day for like 4 weeks straight?
Well, it's not the opening the Lego bag every day that's the adventurous part. It's the iron builder make a comic every day for 24 days part. Because with the advent calendars, where I've opened an actual Lego advent calendar, I have made a comic every day during those, barring a couple of periods where I had technical issues and I had to double up to catch up. They have all been made on the spot on the day.
That's impressive.
Uh, in more recent years, in the last couple of years, this year I didn't do that at all for any comic. I just wasn't into any of Lego's advent calendars, so I just didn't get one. But I had advent calendar like content. It just wasn't an actual me opening a Lego advent calendar.
I mean, that was kind
Uh,
of the joke of this last Advent was that you didn't have it. They didn't have an actual Advent calendar.
and in the last 2 years, the more advent calendar-ish stuff that I've done has been on Crossbricks, which we will talk about at a later date.
Oh, right. I
Uh,
forgot that got moved over to that.
Whereas Aquazone Breakfast News became just partly because I wanted to change up. There weren't any interesting new advent calendars, and I wanted to do something different rather than Lucian and Alex open a Star Wars advent calendar and fight off the evil Peaches and
The evil
shenanigans happen.
Peaches, man. Always the evil Peaches.
They are very
Just a slight
typecast at
side
this
note,
point.
I feel like we should have a topic about evil Peaches and the effect on flesh tone minifigs had in our world. We'll have to do that as a podcast, but continuing with the Advent calendar topic.
Yeah, no, you said you're looking for topics. How to integrate flesh tone minifigs is there's some good meat on that bone. And the meat on that bone for me is that So my first advent calendar I used for Aquazone Breakfast News, I used a city advent calendar. And of course, that means there were police and there were robbers because
Classic one.
city
That,
advent
I would say
calendar.
that was like the advent calendar that like really blew up for because that's the one I remember on Reasonably Clever was that one that had the crook with the snowball and or toilet paper or whatever the white piece peel decided it was.
Yeah, it was. That was my first one, and it introduced the character of Tomahawk Windsor, uh,
Character, everyone loves him.
who was who's mostly notable because he's the first side character to last more than a comic or two. So our main characters are Lucian Weatherby and Alexis D'Souza, usually known as Alex, and they are the two hosts, or they were. Spoiler alert: the show has been canceled, but the comic continues. They were the co-hosts of a Sunday morning or a daily morning news
Wednesday morning, in all honesty, for some reason,
a
the boring
a
state.
news light morning talk show. You know, they've got guests on, and that was sort of going to be the easy stick. So it would always be easy to take pictures because I would just need one set, the studio where they're talking to people, and I could just cycle different minifigs in, and it would be an excuse to talk about different types of Lego and an excuse to talk about different types of
I mean,
Aquazone,
if
put
you really
interesting
wanted
characters in
farm
there.
content for that, all you need to do is go to your minifig list and pull out a random minifig number and have them interview that person. You could really farm the heck out of this if you really wanted.
And I think there have been times when I actually have come close to doing that. But so it was always the two of them and then whoever their guest of the day was. It wasn't until the advent calendars that we started seeing secondary characters who lasted longer and got names and reappeared. Um, there were sort of maybe some hints towards something like that earlier on with Jacques Clouseau and
I would not call
some of the
Jacques
other
Cousteau a
Aquazone.
reoccurring character. I remember popping like a couple times early, and then I haven't seen him in years.
Yeah, he didn't he the problem with Jacques Clouseau and Aquazone Breakfast News is that Jacques Clouseau is sort of the stereotype for me of a drama character, which means he belongs in a comic like Grandfather's Tale or a comic like Android Files. He doesn't belong in Aquazone Breakfast
You know,
News, even though it's about
News is the
Aquazone.
comic for fig barfs and uh the peasants, the civilians, not the knights and warriors.
Yeah, if you're a canonical fig with a story, you don't belong anywhere near this comic.
So basically, what you're saying is, if let's say, for an example, my Bionicle collection, I have all the sets built, but I also have a bunch of made-up characters. This would be for all those made-up Bionicles who don't have names; they're just random mocks of mine.
Yeah, the random ones, not Onvermel. Onvermel's
No,
too canonical
me.
for
I
Aquazone
am too
Breakfast News.
canonical.
So that was the first year, and then the second year. So this is sort of right in the middle of my good updating years. I did a Star Wars Advent calendar,
Ah, the classic
which
one. Well,
which was an interesting turning point for me because up until that Advent calendar, I had just sort of refused to really get any Star Wars sets anymore since the color change, or more accurately, since the flesh tone change.
funnily
I
enough, this
was
was
too
during my
invested,
phase when I wasn't buying Star Wars sets either, for different reasons. I just had no interest.
and it wasn't a complete turnaround. It took until about 2017 when I got into Clone Wars and Rebels for me to really get back into
Took you
Star
guys
Wars
too long.
Lego.
It took you guys way too long to get into Clone Wars, I tell you.
Whenever I get into something, that means it's officially dead. Um,
Clone Wars isn't
but
dead though. That's the thing. It came back.
well, it wasn't for any lack of trying. Let's put it that way. Uh, so it was an important turning point for me because I'd avoided Star Wars since the color change. The only Star Wars sets that I'd gotten since the color change had either been gifts where someone else gave them to me, or Some of the battle packs where the clones or the stormtroopers had black heads.
They weren't canonically, they weren't Peach, so you can get away with it.
They weren't Peach, so they could get away with it. But the Advent calendar, I went out of my way to get it, and I did it to get content for Aquazone Breakfast News,
I mean,
but it meant that I needed to confront the Peachy
I'm
problem.
actually curious. Is it this the one with Santamal in it?
Yes, this is the one with
I'm curious
Santamal.
about this because I remember up here in the Great White North, Zach, Ek, and I had all gone. Actually, no, I never got one. I don't know. I can't remember if I did or didn't. But we basically got them like discounted, like really cheap because they just didn't sell at the Lego stores. So we got really. Did you get yours like on sale, like where down there, or did you get your pay full price?
It is definitely possible that I got mine on sale, but I don't remember for sure, partly because it wasn't relevant. I was going to get it anyway. That's the one that I had planned to do that year.
I mean, let's be.
And
I'm just gonna
Santa
say
Mall was
this.
part of the reason.
I'm just going to say this. Santamal has had a very lasting impact on all of our verses, except for Zach Tab. But between like you, me, and Ek, uh, all for different reasons, like all for very different reasons, that thing has stayed with us.
Well, for me, the reason was Aquazone Breakfast News. That was maybe not as groundbreaking as the city one the year before because I'd already done it once, but it was more, it had a bigger impact on the pattern of Aquazone Breakfast News because by introducing the evil Peaches,
Well, that opened a can of worms for actual breakfast news, which was a good and bad thing at the same time, I think.
yeah, it opened a can of worms and it sort of became the dominant feature of Aquazone Breakfast News right through the great hiatus. And I'm saying that there was a single hiatus much bigger than the other ones,
Was it the one
roughly
after the
from
spiders had kidnapped them, or around that time?
around that time.
That
So
was
the
such.
spiders that
I
yeah, the
remember that it was such a long time, and then you just like time skipped and like, oh look, we're all alive and good and great.
well, yeah, so in 2013 I got a full-time job, a real job, and for the rest of that year I kind of limped along. I managed to get out a bunch of Saturday updates and I did an advent calendar, although you can tell that I'm working because the lighting isn't good in a lot of the pictures. And that one I did the Friends advent calendar, and it turned out okay. The Friends, being flesh toned, ended up at more evil Peaches. And but the year after, partly because I had started it having lore, it started to develop into an epic. Um, and because of work, it was harder and harder to update. I fell behind. And then, like, springtime, I just stopped updating completely for months.
Honestly, we
In
all
the
finally quit.
fall, in the fall, I brought back a few advent calendars. I was going to make my own advent calendar. I wasn't going to buy one. I was just going to make something for every type. It lasted about 7 or 8 episodes, but it was long enough for us to sort of say, hey, in all the time that you missed, the epic stuff was so epic, man, you should have been there.
The greatest cop out ever in our web comics. Oh,
And it's
almost. I've pulled something very similar with our joint comic one time. We'll I can't. Okay, I'm just gonna say this. I can't wait until we talk about crossover championship because there's so much to say about that first year.
that first year was another one of those really good learning experiences, but it had some problems.
Oh, definitely.
Uh,
Trust me, when we get the other boys on, because yes, we are going to have all four of us on talking about that because we're going to need to. But it's like with all the other comics, it is like, I would say looking at Aquazone Breakfast News is like the easiest lessons to learn about not only how to possibly make a good format, but possibly what not to do if you want to make one similar to that. Is like keep to the low amount of characters and the week by week story rather than a well, you basically not a what's the term for shows where they have ongoing plots.
it's not
Yes,
serialized.
that's not. I mean, sure they reference old episodes, but it's like. And the funny thing is, I actually almost I had plans to make a parody of Alakazam. Well, not parody per se, but a alternate Alakazam Breakfast News with an Aquashark version called the Shark Tank. I did make one comic for it, and those characters in that set do exist. And so I was like, I would have to actually look at your comic and be like, okay, what does this do, and how can I technically make it better? Because the whole joke would be is that they're like the superior channel. At least in their eyes, they would be. I don't know if they actually were.
Yeah, so going back to where I was at
Yeah,
with
little side tangent.
it sort of became another one of the defining features is the we skipped over the important stuff and we're just here for the trivial stuff. Um, and that was a learning experience for me, obviously, that the
Don't.
trying to do the epic in Aquazone Breakfast News didn't work. And if you look at the timeline, I was trying to do that, and then it all fell apart going into 2014. What did I start in 2014? Android
You
Files.
did?
So
Long
there,
ago?
I started in it.
Did you first post the first one?
I think the original. All right, so I kind of have to go backwards here. I I think I started thinking about it in 2014 and started posting it in 2015. 2015 is when we moved from our apartment into town, and I definitely had pictures taken before the
I
move.
don't think you had posted it yet because I moved out in 2016. I'm pretty sure Android Files wasn't a thing before I moved out.
It may not have been a big thing anyway, but there definitely is a chronological cause and effect here where I started doing Android Files because of what I learned in Aquazone Breakfast News, which is that I can't update it on a weekly basis. It's just not, or I can, but I have to be able to make it in batches. And if you make it in batches, you've got to, um, you know, plan it a little bit more.
Mm,
Um, and so I kind of revisited the grandfather's tale idea at that time because it was looking better to me having tried the other stuff first. But and it looked for all the world like Aquazone Breakfast News was just going to be dead. That was it.
I think we all
Wasn't going
thought
to come
that, in
back.
all honesty.
And there was a very big hiatus from those comics advent, early advent of 2014 until advent of 2017.
Yeah, it was a bit of a gap. Not gonna lie.
There's actually, I think, three different comics that went up during the gap, and they're kind of random. They're towards the end of the gap, so you could maybe call them a hint that I was going to come back. But I talked before about how Star Wars came back for me, like full bore, not just sort of half.
That's it. I would say Star Wars came back for like a lot of us around that time because yourself, Mithra, and even like Ek. Well, Ek was always like Ek and Zacta were always like Star Wars hype training. But like for you and Mithra, I remember like actually deciding to watch the Clone Wars roughly the same time, and I think pretty much everyone just started to watch the Clone Wars roughly the same time. Well, except me. I started watching it before you guys, but you wouldn't listen at first.
Yeah, so I got into the Clone Wars in early 2017. And part of the reason that I got into it is
Rebels was
I had access to Netflix and I needed something to watch. But the real reason that I chose the Clone Wars is that okay, I got to backtrack a little bit here. In 20
was
in early 2017, Lego released a set based on season 3 of Rebels. It's the Phantom Shuttle, and in addition to Kanan and Chopper and the shuttle, there's a Grand Admiral Thrawn beneath it.
very nice.
Grand Admiral Thrawn is a character who originally existed in Star Wars Legends, and the books that he's a part of were some of my favorite in Legends. So I, without knowing anything really about the show, was just super excited that Thrawn was canon again, and it made me want to watch the show. But Rebels wasn't on Netflix, but the Clone Wars was, and I knew just from enough interneting, just from
That they were
seeing stuff
connected.
pop across my Facebook, I knew that there was stuff in Rebels like Rex and Ahsoka that came from Clone Wars. And I'm like, well, I'm bored. I want to watch something, and I want to know, and I want to watch Rebels at some point. So let's watch the Clone Wars. Let's give it a try. And so I'd never tried Clone Wars before, which is to my shame.
We basically
But
all disowned it, I think, because of Ahsoka. At least from that first taste of the Clone Wars, the movie, like basically the pilot episode, I'm going to call it.
yeah, I'd say Ahsoka was part of it, but to blame it all on her is a little bit unfair to
However, at
Ahsoka.
least for me specifically, that was it. I was just so dumbfounded that Anakin had an apprentice, and I just like died inside. I'll admit, I take everything back because Ahsoka's become like one of the coolest, most awesome characters in Star Wars. So
There's a little bit of a danger that the live action shows are going to overuse her or make her too cool, but in the meantime, I'm on board with that. And anyway, they can't do anything to dissuade my love of the Clone Wars because I started watching the Clone Wars, and I don't think I was even an episode in or more than two episodes in when everything that I'd had issues with about the prequels before was now something I love. I like Jar Jar Binks
what
now.
can I say?
I love battle droids now. I like the Attack of the Clones is legitimately my second favorite Star Wars movie now.
See, that's still confuses me because for me, it's definitely not my. It's the original six is probably still my. Nah, it's probably tied for least favorite. But I will say this about the Clone Wars: it legitimately makes the prequels like much like it improves the prequel so much by having all that other context in there.
Yeah, I still can't even quite lay my finger on how much I disliked those movies before. And I mean, I never hated them. I always did like Star Wars, so I never completely hated the prequels. There was always good stuff in there, even if I wasn't on board with everything. But I would have ranked the movies, all the original ones first, and then all the prequel ones later. And watching the Clone Wars, and I think it was a combination of watching the Clone Wars after having seen Force Awakens and Rogue One, both of which I liked, and both of which sort of primed me for this Star Wars revival, but I also had issues with them. And I think watching the Clone Wars, I realized my issues with them are that they're not the prequels, and I love the prequels.
You know that's fair. And so all this like lovely timing with Star Wars, with getting like advent calendars with Star Wars, you kind of probably all fed into each other very well to kind of at least revive or keep the comic going to an extent, or and killed it at the same time too. Like Star Wars revived and killed. I would say what's it called? Aquazone Breakfast News a little bit. I have a hard time remembering that name for some reason today.
Yeah, so that was a big year for me. I totally got back into Star Wars. That's when I started really buying Star Wars Lego sets again, even though they were peach. And as Christmas was coming, I wanted the Star Wars Advent calendar because it had Sabine in it, and I wanted a Sabine. And I'm like, well, if I'm buying an Advent calendar, I'm buying a Star Wars Advent calendar. You know what? I haven't had because I've never bought an Advent calendar and didn't turn it into a comic ever. If I've bought an Advent calendar for myself, it's always turned into a comic. And I mean, I'm talking about 3 calendars before that, but it seemed like the appropriate thing to do. So Aquazone Breakfast News came back, and it's been back ever since. Not consistently. There have been
It's
lots
not.
of
I wouldn't say it's now
hiatuses.
been on a hiatus. Then it's just taken. It's just been having some lapses of gaps, but I wouldn't say it's been on a hiatus since then.
Well, maybe put it this way: its update schedule is now December 1st to 25th, and whatever random Saturdays I feel like.
Which you know what is it's fair. That's fair. And but I do kind of feel like Actual Breakfast News in a lot of ways is kind of the template that a lot of our comics have taken, or at least branched off from. Because some have, I would say, because I would say it does kind of have the whole sense of it knows that it's almost a toy. Like it almost has a self awareness of being toys, which in a large sense of a pirate's life being fourth wall breaking elder figs, old figs, has become a part, or even in randomly assembled, there's a lot of well, you could say like even like I mean Zach has got so many different types of stories in randomly assembled, but I would say at least something like in the kitchen with Dave is partially inspired by Agnes Breakfast Noodle, but being in a single studio dealing with like one sort of subject with a punchline at the end, or even me basically taking just a single theme and kind of just running with kind of jokes there and maybe sometimes poking fun at sets. Because Rock Miners, I would say, is most like was definitely a template taken from Aquazone Breakfast News, with maybe a little less of main characters. Kind of. Let's be honest, I was going to change eventually, but and maybe just like the format, maybe just doing like without because like before that had Grandfather's Tale, which was an actual epic, but this was like the first time it was like a comic that was it was a comic. It was like a Sunday. It was like a in your newspaper kind of comic, which Zach, myself, and Eck to some extent have all very much copied that template for at least one of our comics.
Yeah, and I think you're missing sort of the biggest imitator is one that I did too, which is no. Well, I mean, yes, but no. I'm talking about crossover championship. The
But the
the only comic that I would say is in continuity with Aquazone Breakfast News is crossover championship.
I'm
Lucian and Alex actually appeared in that first year as the commentators from my universe.
well, let's be honest. Aquazone Breakfast News was sponsoring your team, and it's funny because even my team was sponsored and technically in continuity with my comic, though my comic never referenced it because I was already on. Basically, I think that put mine on hiatus. I didn't have effort to do two comics, and
Yeah, it.
even Zach I believe. It is sponsored by Randomly Assembled or Spanky's Intergalactic Junkyard, which essentially I would say Spanky's Intergalactic Junkyard is the epitome of Randomly Assembled. Basically, what truly means to be randomly assembled is Spanky. And then
It's randomly assembled
although
personified.
X was sponsored by the Blacktron, though I do believe canonically it connects to Fez and uh, A Pirate's Life. So like Crossover Championship very much does connect everything. So yes, in some senses, Aquazone Breakfast News is connected to the rest of our comics in a loose way.
Yeah, it's since the return, it's been uneven because I sort of don't know what it's about. Um, it's about the advent calendars, except as I said, I got bored with the advent calendars and I changed
Lastly,
them
the last
around.
while I remember, they've been wanting to talk about Star Wars on a podcast, but can't. The whole joke is that they can't find anyone who actually knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, the idea of turning it into a podcast was me trying to reinvent it while also going back to its roots. So the roots of Aquazone Breakfast News are Lucian and Alex talk to random minifigs and we have a punchline.
But you canceled the
And
show.
but I canceled the show partly because I was tired of the physical set. I still have it. I just it's not big enough to take pictures from enough angles, and I didn't have the right pieces and the right colors to rebuild it any larger. And I don't know. After like 6 years at that point, I was done with it. So it was also a chance to involve the Time Cruisers more because I love the Time Cruisers, and Mystic Mountain Time Lab makes a good backdrop for things. And Mystic Mountain Time Lab and the Time Cruisers are also a better um, in universe. Yeah, a better in universe reason for just involving any minifig you want. I don't have to come up with a reason why they.
Let's be honest. The reason you came up with before was Lily using a hypno disc to bring everyone there. That was invented by another kooky old scientist with a mustache.
Yeah, and I should have just run with that maybe a little bit more obviously, but it didn't fully occur to
Well,
me.
it was too early. Like, you
Um,
basically abandoned that so early on too that you probably just forgot about it. And all. In fairness, speaking of,
yeah,
Rufus, said scientist, did actually appear in the crossover championship last year that Zach put on. So
this is true.
again, there's still life from Axel Breakfast News and other comics.
it is perhaps the most crossover friendly of all the comics I've
Because
done.
it's not lore driven. You can't cross over Android files. And Crossbricks isn't really anything. You can't. Crossbricks is too random to really even cross over and recognize it as Crossbricks. But Aquazone Breakfast News has enough of a presence that you'd recognize if it crossed into something. But it'd be like, I would say this, trying to introduce Crossbricks into a crossover with another TV show would be like trying to have a crossover with SNL sketches. It wouldn't really work. You can't have an SNL sketch crossover with Gilligan's Island, but you can have, Mickey cartoons crossover with Gilligan's Island, if that makes any sense.
That's not a bad analogy, I think. And yeah, because it's so elastic, it is kind of wishy-washy at times. So, like, a good example of this, and one that actually gave it a lot of content, is my Bionicle Revival last year.
Ah, wait,
I got back into Bionicles about a year ago now.
I'm a part of the podcast. We've reached it. Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, so I got back into Bionicles about a year ago, maybe a little bit more, depending on where you sort of draw the line, after quite literally a decade of just not being into
My
Bionicles.
collection thanks you for that.
And like, yeah, I'd literally gotten rid of a bunch of my Bionicles. Now, fortunately, I didn't like put them in a dumpster or give them to Value
Oh,
Village, but
those other three podcast bros are just sitting here pretty with some of your nice Iraqian masks.
I no longer have them. And um, in the last year plus now, I have reversed course on that very, very hard, to the point that
There's
um,
some breakfast news.
to the point that I wanted Lego Bionicle. I wanted Bionicle stuff in my comics, and the easiest way to do that is to toss it into Aquazone Breakfast News. So Aquazone Breakfast News had roughly a 4-month long sort of subplot that involved energized protodermis, just because.
I mean, why not? I mean, it did kind of. It's been interesting. It did work well with some of the side characters. Like, actually, it's been really fun. And I mean, I feel like you're not going to ever elaborate too much on everything. I feel like it's just left open ended, which I think was probably intentional.
It is pretty intentional. It's not intended to be the definitive statement of my Bionicle lore. For that, you need to go to my Tumblr account. But
Good luck,
uh,
folks.
it is an element of it was something I wanted to do, so that was the place that got it, because that's what Aquazone Breakfast News can be. It is my go-to if I want it to be important, but it's not so important that it needs to be canon. It goes into Aquazone Breakfast News.
Another thing that I was thinking about with Aquazone Breakfast News is it essentially is a almost a history of what sort of either what you're into or what's really grasped your attention in like said given times. Because like you look at it, you can see what sort of stuff perked your interest. Because there was definitely a really heavy Lord of the Rings presence earlier, where okay, the Lord of the Rings sets came out. That was obviously the Lego you were most interested in, and then you probably see a Star Wars impact. Like you could almost carbon date what sort of Lego was most gripping you. Unlike Android Files, which is like a way to see into your past, how you visualize your Lego games. This is more so actually seeing, okay, let's see what how much he's been buying, what he's been buying, what he's been doing with his Lego. Like it's more of a almost a history of your interest in Lego to an extent.
Yeah, there's definitely archaeological evidence in the comics. And 2021 will definitely go down as he was into Bionicles that year.
It officially came back
Um,
because let's be honest, I don't think Bionicle ever showed up in Aquazone Breakfast News before. Maybe like on a passing comment before, but
I don't even know if there'd been a passing comment on any of my Lego webcomics. And then Aquazone Breakfast News not only
because you mentioned
uh,
Bionicle about as much as the Lego movie did.
that's not a terrible reference, no. that would be somewhat accurate. And the Christmas the non-Advent calendar Advent calendar that I did this year. So this year and last year, Aquazone Breakfast News really leaned into the crossover element. Dr. Cyber has a hypnodisc that could talk to other Lego universes by specifically soliciting pictures from the three other Lego brothers, you and Zach and Ek. Give those to me, and I will.
Let's do.
I will make content out of it. Yes, I'm sourcing out my picture taking to a cheaper country.
You would think that'd be the
Uh,
easiest thing that we could possibly do. That I will do that, yet I'm always like, I don't know, near the deadline for that. That's funny.
yeah, this year I cut it a little bit close. So even though it was supposed to be all made in advance, I was in fact finishing it during December. Um, but so this year it was about Bionicles. Broke up the month, the 24 days, into blocks of 6. So that's 4 days
I would say I think
each
we've
one of
officially
us.
left that slight side tangent. I don't know if I'll. I can see maybe the Pro Endurance game brought up a couple more times, but I think we've officially mostly moved on from that.
Mostly. The
Story
very
for
last.
Brickstow's Bonkles popping in with Trogadoom and a Borak. Who knows where that's going to go, if anywhere.
Yeah, I wouldn't count on it anywhere, but we'll explain why when we get to Crossbrick.
We will. We
Uh,
will.
but yeah, Aquazone Breakfast News, I would not expect it to become a permanent Bionicle comic, but you also never know because I literally have no idea where I'm going next week. And the last thing that happened is Dr. Cyber running in saying, oh no, she's having a delayed reaction to the energized protodermis, and our guest of the week piecing out because he doesn't want anything to do with
The
it.
guests of the week always do that, but we've covered a lot of stuff with the comic. Its origins, side tangents. I think we've gone over most of it. So, I got, as the usual, two questions. I'm going to just ask, do you have any like an end in sight, and do you have any still stuff with Aquazone Breakfast? So before you're done with it, you still want to get like something done, like either a story, like let's say like maybe there's like just one like comic you want to make before you're done. Is there any like ambitions and or at end in sight?
So I have no ambitions with Aquazone Breakfast News. Aquazone Breakfast News has already outlived its original intent. Its original intent was to put weekly content up on my blog. The blog is dead. I have no intention of reviving it. It's all moved over to Comic Fury, and Android Files has taken over as my comic of record, so to speak. Aquazone Breakfast News, it's just gravy. If I keep putting stuff up on Saturdays and I keep putting stuff up during Advent, great. I hope so, because I like making comics. I like having made them. I really believe in a general sense that making stuff and being creative is a part of the worthwhile part of being human. Like it's sort of one of the things to live for in this life.
That's the most
And
thought-provoking thing this podcast has ever heard. By the way, thank you for that.
and Lego comics are how I enjoy doing them.
How
Um,
most of us.
but if I never make another one, which is possible, I won't count that as terrible because it's not like I've left the story hanging. I've left the story hanging so many times now that leaving the story hanging is the most appropriate way to leave it hanging.
It's not allowed to have like a farewell comic. No, it's
It would defeat the joke of so many previous comics if I did that.
I no.
It would be showing you the Battle of the 11 Armies when the whole joke is that you don't see it.
Wait, was that the whole thing with the 11 armies, or did you just come up with that now? I can't remember if it was actually supposed to be 11.
No, that was the actual thing, the Battle of the 11
Okay.
Armies, which is
I guess in the book of the Battle of Fire Armies, you don't see the battle either.
yeah, that's true. You sort of skip around, and that might have been what suggested it to me. But of course, I had to dial it up to 11.
Well, of course. So, no, that's. I think of all the ones I've talked to so far, I would say Actual Breakfast News has a definitive least end in sight. Because, like, all the others that we've kind of talked about with all the other similes either have, like, an end or, to an extent, I think Fez is kind of like the other one where it's like, it'll go as long as I feel like it. But this one definitely feels like the most like it could die at any moment, and there's like nothing's stopping it. There's no
It's
grander things that need to be done. Everything that's been said, that needs to be said, has been said. The guests have been guested. There's, it just goes where it wants now, and if it gets lost in a forest, so be it.
pretty much. It's. I mean, I think that I will at some point want to do another traditional advent calendar with it.
Oh, probably.
But that's partly on you, Lego. You got to make one that I'm interested in. Lego made 5 advent calendars last year, and I wasn't interested in any of
They
them.
haven't made an Aquazone Advent calendar yet. It's very sad.
And I've thought or talked about making my own advent calendar, and I've sort of did that with Crossbricks this last year, but we'll talk about that with Crossbricks. And I sort of started to do that the year that the Great Hiatus began, but I think I've learned that making your own advent calendar sucks. It's just not interesting. It's not as fun as opening and finding out what you're getting.
Oh, definitely. It's well, half of the fun is being surprised and seeing what sort of comic you make out of said surprise. Like it's made. Well, as you said, most of those are made on the fly, which probably makes them just much more fun. But we've already kind of covered that. So I think we'll be ending this here and say this has been fun. I hope everyone who's listened has enjoyed, and please subscribe, like, share, comment, all the good stuff. If anyone's even made it this far who doesn't already subscribe, probably not. But yeah, I have been your host, Onvermel, and this has been the T.O.A podcast, and we are retiring from the night.